Thank you.
Hello, everybody. And we want to set up this discussion so it's not just a panel and we are talking. It's a fireside chat. Imagine this is a fireplace and we're just talking and you can join the discussion at any time. And actually, there's a fire, as you can see, because that's how we see open source in the last years. And I agree, actually, a few years ago, the most exciting thing in open source was like RISC-V? And everybody was talking about it, and it was a new big thing. But I think in the recent years, it's a lot of things starting to happen. So to introduce ourselves, we're actually representing here Cyprus Open Source Technology Association, also known as COSTAS.
It's a new thing.
It's a new thing. We actually registered it just this year. But we've been in open source for quite some time. So that's what we want to discuss today, but to celebrate about it.
Yeah, celebrate, and also, how many of you feel like this? Just show hands. Okay. So then for the rest of you, we will basically try to make sure that, at the end of this fireside chat, you're all like, I want to do something.
No, but like Cyprus in the EU, it's like mixed flesh.
Yes.
And EU is doing lots of stuff these days, and I honestly haven't seen people in Cyprus discussing it.
Yeah, and I actually happen to be, like I used to be last year, on the board of Apache Software Foundation. So I get invited to a lot of things just because people kind of reach out. So last year we went to this big Brussels event, put together by the European government, trying to figure out, what to do with all of you open source developers, because apparently there needs to be something done with all of you. And it's funny because, if you go there, they actually use the same facility that they use for all the negotiations, right? Actual real ones, right? You go into this building. And I think you said
European Commission.
Yeah, European Commission, and I think you said at the table, label.
Yeah. So one of the rooms actually had country labels because it's the room where all the countries usually preside, and it had the label Cyprus. And of course, I took that seat because why not? But yeah, there was nobody from Cyprus.
And which is kind of strange because again, there's actually a lot happening right now. But I think at least there are some people in Germany, France, who are sort of concerned about it. But in Cyprus, it's well, I guess, when they come with some legislation, it'll just affect us somewhat. But we feel that's a very dangerous approach. It's sort of like one of those things where you kind of try to stay out of politics, and then you find out that politics doesn't really stay out of you. So, but yeah, there's a lot of things happening. So at least, in the past year, two big, really huge, developments in open source that I have noticed, and I've been in open source for a pretty long time. AI is really big, and, people talk about, LLMs and ChatGPT, and all of that is fun, but, the open source aspect of AI is even more fun, and we will talk about that. The other one is that I think Europe has decided to basically build up on the success of GDPR and really regulate the heck out of everything, and that's the CRA legislation. That acronym you should really sort of remember. There's also AI Act, and it has gotten so bad that at the Open Source Congress, for real, we were discussing that if this legislation comes to pass, and actually, how many of you do know about CRA?
It stands for Cyber Resilience Act?
Resilience Act. The Cyber Resilience Act, yes. You do. Okay, one person. So it's basically this attempt of a European government to regulate our industry as though it was physical sort of, supply chain manufacturing thing. But software is definitely not that. And the ultimate takeaway is that, they're trying to put the liability on all of you individual open source developers. With a few exceptions, here and there, but in all of our licenses right there's a statement that basically says the software is provided with no warranty whatsoever. Use it at your own risk, and that is right in the license. So this is a big deal because the license is a product of an American legal system, and if that license all of a sudden gets in conflict with the legislation that gets passed in EU, the legislation wins because that's how the countries work. The other country cannot tell, European countries, how this should work. And if the Europe decides that that license is invalid in Europe, well, guess what? You no longer have access to any of the open source software.
Let's give an example. Like something happened, like a vulnerability. Everybody remembers, hopefully, Log4j. So, for example, that happens, and somebody in a bank was using it, and like they become vulnerable. Something happens. Who do you think is liable? So, who can you go and sue as a bank who was using software that had it inside? Like in America, you sue the company that sells you the product or integrates it for you. So it's either a corporation providing product or a system integrator. So Europe is not doing that. Europe is saying, but like you developed it, and since it's open source, you can actually know who developed it, so you're liable.
Which sort of makes sense in the physical industry, right? It's like if you're developing a part, and all of a sudden that part gets used, like, I don't know, in a Boeing or like BMW, and like that part is known to be defective, like, yeah, sure, it's your responsibility. You develop the part. But it doesn't work like that in our industry, because even if I develop the part, how you would use my part is completely unknown to me. And one man's vulnerability could be another man's feature. Like, just like it's software, it's very, very malleable. But again, the interesting thing is, remember how a certain open source foundation that is now headquartered in Europe?
Yeah, actually, before recent years, a lot of foundations went to Europe for different reasons. Some went to Switzerland, like this Pi Foundation is incorporated in Switzerland. Some went to other countries, but basically now all these foundations have to answer the question, what do they do if this passes? Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are ways to try and show people before it passes that it's risky, and there are some ideas like let's stop all the downloads of open source software for 1 week and see how Europe would react.
That, by the way, is Prep Week, CRA Protection Week. So, like, we seriously at the Open Source Foundations level started to discuss. It's like, okay, so like we need to show what it would mean if this legislation passes. Like, we would literally block all of the downloads of our software from the EU geolocated IP addresses, because the software under the licenses we have would be illegal here. Like, what else would you expect from us? So that hasn't really happened yet. But again, if all of a sudden your builds start to break, like, I don't know, 2 months from now, hey, maybe that ended up being the only option. We're still trying to really avoid it. Because I think it's actually funny because, like, the biggest takeaway for me is, like, once geeks start to do politics, it's really funky.
That's Open Source Congress for you. All the like foundation, like Linux Foundation, Apache Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, OSI, everybody was there, sitting in Geneva and discussing like, how do we stop it? And basically 2 days later, they decide like, we don't. And you know why? Because they're American. They're fine actually with it. Yeah. And this is the second part of the slide, because actually, the countries that win from this is basically United States and China. They're fine.
They're actually completely fine. Yes, both countries are completely fine. And it's interesting because, in U.S., there's actually similar legislation, going on. But for once, they did a smart thing. Actually, not for once. I mean, they, like, in that area, like, typically do a smart thing. And they basically, like, moved it to the National Institute of Standards, which means it will die a slow death, like, see something come out in, like, 15 years. But for reals, I mean, like, you don't give that into the hands of, like, normal politicians that are basically just eager to regulate things as though, your grandmother can understand, the regulations, right? It does not work out, does not compute. And how it's going to shake out, I mean, right here to basically tell you what's going on. I mean, I really wish Cyprus actually has a voice, and that's, one of the reasons for the COSTAS. Basically have some kind of an organization where these types of issues will get discussed, and, kind of like we can maybe even get some leverage at the government level. But I think, it's real.
No, but I think it's also important, like, I mean, we understand none of people here are politicians probably, so it's not like you're going to lobby it and find ways to solve it. Again, even the large open source foundation didn't. So it's okay. I think one of the questions is, okay, so first of all, be aware that it's happening and think how it affects you. And second, there are some implications coming from this. So it's not that it stops developing a open source software altogether, but it's just reshifting the power in the market. And it's actually interesting how. So in many countries, I think it will go mostly to the large companies.
Yeah, like system integrators, yeah.
Right, and actually, when we say system integrator, it doesn't mean only like the actual integrators. Siemens is a system integrator.
Yeah.
A lot of large corporations are. And they can manage these legal risks, and they can manage the supply chain. And so if you're working for Siemens, you're fine. So basically, large corporations that people will be donating to open source from is one way. Another could be universities. And that's, I think, one of the ways we can look at it in Cyprus, because actually we've been talking to a bunch of different projects that wanted to incorporate in Europe. So like scientific foundation, like the
Python NumPy Foundation,
Foundation. So some of them are already incorporated in the US and want like a lag in Europe. So the question is where? And Cyprus sounds like a reasonable place to do that. Again,
I mean, besides if you squint, I mean, the weather sort of nature looks like Silicon Valley, like if you squint.
Yes, it's squint a lot. But I think involving universities becomes even more reasonable than in usual open source days. So it's not just people who develop and join it, but also the ways to protect people doing it from university labs. But there are many other ideas. So it's just but I think again being aware of it is.
But you know what's interesting to me is that we all have sort of relatively short memories. And like if you think about it, like unless you're, I don't know, older, like you don't even remember that, open source licenses were not a given. Like they were not here, 30 years ago. Like Apache Software Foundation is actually kind of funny because just like software has revisions, our license also has revisions. So it started with version 1, then it was version 1.1, and now it's at version 2.0. I actually highly recommend kind of like comparing it, like almost doing a diff, like you would do a diff with software and seeing like how the license evolved. And you would see that we actually had to answer to the challenges that were around us at the time, right? So it wasn't really a fixed thing. But now, like, if you talk to kids, if they're like, well, yeah, open source is, these types of licenses and, like, these types of foundations. But to me, the cool thing is none of it is a given. So it is what we make it to be. That's actually why in 2023, I mean, being an open source developer is kind of cool because you basically
options.
Yeah.
You can just sign it without reading like the privacy policy. Or you can actually participate in also redefining it. And one cool thing about, again, 2023 is that in AI, none of this is given.
Yes.
And this is another part that is actually interesting these days because, there are all these foundations, there are all these licenses, and then there is AI that kind of none of them apply directly to. So there are now new waves of it and completely new organizations trying to define these licenses. Like who knows the responsible AI license?
Actually, sure, I can.
Yeah.
Actually, Nico, let's ask a different question. How many of you guys have accounts on Hugging Face? Okay, pretty much same people. Okay. Well, you really you can forget everything that we talk about today, but just go and check out Hugging Face, make an account there, make it a 3-letter account because those will be the coveted ones in 2-3 years. Hugging Face is basically, it's like, GitHub is for software developers. Hugging Face is like GitHub for AI people. And I don't mean like AI people that talk to ChatGPT, actual real AI people that develop the software and, try to figure out how to actually train the models and, all of that. It's a brand new world out there.
And basically, so there is this responsible AI license that Hugging Face created. So you can already see that it's a new company that nobody heard about. It actually appeared just a few years ago. But growing like crazy, by the way. So it's venture funded, and the recent round, I think, what was 500 million?
500 million, yeah.
Yeah, so it's basically nowadays, not even foundations are defining the license. And I'm not saying it's a good license. So if you actually read it, you can see that it's not the Apache 2.0 for you.
No, it's not. And it's kind of like it's a weird license because it's full of things you cannot really define, let alone enforce. I can remember, a few years ago at Apache, we had this big debate about, this license do not be evil license. Who knows about do not be evil license? Okay, well, pretty much the same people. Okay, you guys can keep just raising your hand. Just like shoot them up in the air and but yeah, so the guy by the name Doug Crawford, sort of the father of Jason and all these other things. He's actually a funny character, like a really funny one. I used to work with him at Yahoo. He created this license that basically said, like, you could use my software if what you do with it makes no evil things in the world happen. Now, like, you cannot really define that, right? So at Apache, you basically have to pass a judgment saying we will not allow software under that license because, you obviously cannot really, reinforce it. It's the same with AI. Like, the Rail license is full of those same statements. It's like, thou shalt not create the Skynet out of this thing that is licensed by this. Like, what is that?
Oh, that is also funny Chinese licenses. That you should not use it against China.
That is actually the funniest one. No, it's not just against China. That is like, thank you for reminding me. It's for you shall not use it against the well-being of the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah. And I'm like, Chinese Communist Party is doing fine, thank you very much. Like, how can I, lonesome open source developer topple? But yeah, no.
If you sign the license.
See, if I sign the license, no, I'm completely banned from it. Yeah, there's actually a lot of fun happening, but then there's more.
What Twitter post?
Yeah, more Twitter posts. I guess I can just open up my Twitter account. So this is kind of something. So Henry Yandel is a good friend of mine. He's based in UK, but I think he used to be based in Europe for a long time. He's a big advocate of open source, and just open source agenda. He had to post this on LinkedIn, right? He got because we work a lot with him on all these things, what it would mean to the Apache Software Foundation, how we would react, and he's on the front line of figuring out that it could be really bad. So this is his post, right? Basically lamenting the state of the European government and the attitudes. And it's kind of funny because if you talk to some people. It feels like, they're basically saying the government can do no wrong. And I'm like, have you checked the news over the past 2 years? I mean...
In any country?
In any country, really? I mean... but yeah, I basically had to quote it and say, Tanya and I wanted to do the sort of AI company. We could talk to us what it will be after this panel. And, one idea was maybe to do it in Europe, But
not anymore.
Yeah, no, we figured out we cannot do it in Europe.
This is actually a full disclaimer. We tried not only Europe. So we discussed where it makes sense to have the company incorporated and where does it make sense to have the customers, audience, developers. So we looked at many options, and we're talking that Cyprus is not involved in this discussion as part of EU, but actually a lot of countries are not involved in this discussion at all. Mm-hmm. So EU is at least a conglomerate that kind of involves the opinion, maybe secondary opinion, but still. But we actually, for example, talked to a bunch of people in Israel. I mean, it's right here. You can almost
practical walk to it, yeah.
But actually, so what we figured is that none of these countries will be innovative enough in dictating the things. So as usual, it starts from US, and then everybody else is receptive.
No, like that Israeli dude who is actually pretty high profile, literally told us, right? I mean, we'll be just watching. Yeah.
But again, this is the question, who are you doing it for? So what is your market? Mm-hmm. So, of course, if you're just developing it for fun and you're not taking any money for it, that's a different question. And actually, by the way, people who are developing it for fun and not ever taking any money for it in no form are excluded for European regulations. So, but that needs to be proved.
Yeah, so basically, if you stay homeless, you can totally develop open source software in Europe, for years to come.
But if you want...
Don't take any money from anybody. So.
If you want it to be used, if you want to be used in some products, the question is in which countries the products are being used. So, and basically, a lot of countries answer it in the way that we want our products to be used only in US. We care only about that. If someone uses it, fine. We don't want any money or anything from it. We care about US market. And again, I've been a venture capitalist for 8 years. I worked in a venture capital firm. I know that basically how it usually goes with innovation, that the consumption of innovation starts in the US, and maybe 7-8 years later, other countries join. But actually, I think that AI can change it, and open source AI specifically, because it doesn't have to be like that anymore.
And I actually liked, how we, like you and I discussed it, the other day, that it's also a little bit generational. Because it feels like the AI effectively attracts, sort of the kids who basically are used to a very different, mindset on, when it comes to developing the software. Now, an engineer, like the fundamental engineer in me, is completely terrified of, like, what is going to happen if these kids take over the world. But I'm pretty sure, like, my...
Fun?
Yeah, fun, I guess. Yeah, exactly. But it's very different. It is very different.
But to feel that you can, as Roman said, go to Eigenfaith and just look what's happening there, because it is a platform to share models, to share weights, to collaborate on things, to do the inference there. But when you look at what people are doing and who are these people, they're not engineers. And I see it as a good thing because it basically expands the number of people suddenly working on software, because it's still software.
Yes.
And it's still some kind of application. It doesn't even matter if they go in production or just serve that purpose and disappear tomorrow, which, by the way, happens a lot.
Yep.
But basically, all these people are the people that never had access to developing software, but now they do. And I think that's kind of the same things that happened when the internet was created.
Pretty much, yeah.
Because a lot of people that didn't have access or ever thought that they would have this distribution network for whatever, for content, for opinions, for something, they got it.
You're absolutely right. It actually feels a lot, even the arguments feel a lot like, the arguments I've heard, back in like 90-something about the open source, like, oh, it's never going to work because, all of these people on the internet, what do they know? How can they compete with Microsoft and IBM and all of this? And like, look at us now, right? So it actually feels a lot like that in AI nowadays.
But yeah, if we come back to open source question of AI, it's also a lot of discussions, for example, in the European Union about data supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And these days, there are not only efforts to do foundations for software, but foundations for data. Mm-hmm. Like, who covers data? What is the data supply chain? Do you know what data goes in? What doesn't? Like, can you actually know it?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, all these foundations try to find their places in this new world for AI. And there is a lot of empty spaces at this point, so that are not filled even by desire by any of the foundations. So basically, Linux Foundation goes to this data angle, and you can look it up. They're actually releasing a bunch of very good data.
I think it happened. So they basically have this open source summit in Bilbao, Spain, last week. So there's a lot of announcements, about AI and Data Foundation that's, collecting software and data sets and all of that. So just look it up. I mean, there's a lot of useful stuff there. But actually, let's maybe switch gears a little bit and talk about, if I can. Okay, that goes back. That goes forward. So let's talk a little bit about, because we kind of like keep dishing about Europe, because that was our, past 2 years, but there's actually a lot of interesting stuff happening even in the States that typically when it happens, would affect us all. So how many of you have heard about what has happened with Terraform and Paphos? Oh, more hands. Okay. Awesome. So for those of you who haven't, this is one of those things where, you expect the license to be a protector of your freedom, which is kind of like what Stallman, envisioned when she created GPL. And all of a sudden, that just crumbles because, you just find out that the open source project that your entire business depends on changes the license. And at that point, if that license is incompatible with your business goals, like what are you going to do? Like rip it out of all of your systems? Actually, I'm kind of surprised that not more people have heard about it because in US, so there's this piece of technology called Terraform, which is how you basically manipulate infrastructure on, public clouds and, private in a private data center, like declarative form. It's everywhere. Like everybody's using it. And all of a sudden, the license has become incompatible with business sort of usage. And, it was one of those times when pretty much like the next day, every single VP of legal at every single company, big and small, just had a call and said, like, we need to rip it out. Like, I don't care what it takes. That needs to be ripped out. Like, even if a business stops, like, we can be sued big time. Now, again, the problem got resolved because, a whole bunch of people came together. They forked, the last version of it, which was licensed under the reasonable license terms, moved it to Linux Foundation. It all worked out in the end. But this is a big deal. I mean, the erosion of trust in the open source, I think it's a big deal.
But who thinks they know why it happened? So why did they change the license?
Actually, yeah.
Any thoughts? Like, why?
It's an obvious reasons because
they're just evil and they want people to suffer?
No, because they work and somebody using their product to get back to it.
So, but who is to monetize it? It's not like the company had zero revenue. It had some revenue. So suddenly deciding that you want a different business model is not also something that happens every day.
So any guesses?
Maybe the CEO will change and decide whether we need to worry.
Closer, but like it's kind of like getting warmer. But like, who changes the CEO? Let's go one step further. Like, see, and
yeah, they actually have this thesis why venture capitalists ruin everything, and being a venture capitalist for many years.
It's your word to use. Like, I cannot say that, but you can.
No, but that's basically one of the very basic incompatibilities between open source and capitalist worlds. Because yes, venture capitalists want certain things from their companies. They want them to focus, they want them to grow fast, to have scalable use cases. They basically don't care about the community or usage in other industries or whatever, just number of downloads. They say they care, but they don't. They actually care about the numbers. And if you look at the last reported results of HashiCorp, it's been bad.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, that was one way for them to push it, but that's, I think, one of the fundamental distrusts in the community, that there is always somebody else who can make the decision. And this somebody else is one corporation. And this one corporation has its board.
Yes.
So this is the problem of a lot of open source projects, and not just huge ones. It's not just HashiCorp problem. I actually have seen it in the portfolio of the fund I worked for. It's Almost Capital. You can look it up if you want to. We had a bunch of open source investments.
Actually, some of them, you even moved to Cyprus.
Some of them are here in Cyprus these days, the engineering teams. But I think one of the things that happened to a lot of those companies, it was basically one company open source project. So it never turned into a project supported by a bunch of different products, companies, teams. And that means that the further you grow, the less you care about open source. That should happen to your company too.
Yeah. No, totally. Because, it's, to me, so again, I've been with Linux Foundation and Apache Software Foundation for a really long time as a sort of individual contributor, but also on the, in various, executive, I guess we would say, roles. And it's always been very difficult, for me, because I get invited, to places outside of U.S. and, I try to explain, why foundations are useful and nobody understands it. They're like, well, the project on GitHub is fine. And it is fine until a point, right? Like you were saying. So I co-founded a company. We created this piece of technology that is kind of like was meant to be to edge computing, what Android has become to mobile computing. And, the goal was to basically create a big community around it. And what we figured is, it's next to impossible unless you Google to basically do it alone, right? To do it sort of just by yourself. So, we did the proper thing, we pushed it into Linux Foundation and whatnot. And that worked out. So at least there is sort of a protection, right? There's a protection that nobody can pull a trick like what HashiCorp has done, because now the brand name and the license belong to Linux Foundation. But to your point, it's still not a protection against, sort of the community creation, right? And that's actually why foundations are so important, because they will signal back to you. At some point, like at Apache, if there is no community around the project, there will be a signal that the project is now moving into what's known as attic. And you can still use the software, but it's a signal that the community is not there. So you kind of have to have jury still out. I wish, the project, I'm no longer with the company. So, we're building a different business now. But I still wish that community gets created. But what I do know is that even if the project needs to die, it will die for good reasons, and it will live for good reasons. So think of a foundation as emergency room, right? It would basically state your time of birth and state your time of death, right? Because it's important, right? It's important to know those facts. Otherwise, you can be in this limbo state, and it's just, it doesn't work out.
Yeah. But this is how it looks from the foundation point of view, but from a capitalist point of view, it's still a product. Mm-hmm. You can still sell it. You can sell it to enterprises. And yes, being an open source helps open the doors, helps with compliance, helps with a bunch of stuff to just give enterprises comfort. But again, it does not bring any mechanics that open source is actually meant to give. Mm-hmm. Like no network effects, no community effects, no just opening door effects. It's basically once you have opened the door, you move a little bit faster. That's about it. So, and that's what I mean when I say that the companies care less and less about open source if it's one company's project.
Yes.
Because, again, it doesn't help you change the dynamics. It's kind of a little bit accelerated, but not by much.
I think with AI, it will be different, though. I think with AI, it's so undefined, that the companies basically feel that they don't understand it, they cannot control it. So they don't feel it, they feel that they can get left behind, right? And that's why, this is sort of the second picture. If you look at what's happening in the open source, traditional organizations and foundations in the United States, everybody's rushing to basically redefine AI. Who here knows about OSI organization? Okay. So OSI is basically this place where what it means to be open source gets defined, right? There's a set of principles. And if you come up with a funky, business open source license, they will look at it and say this is crap because of reasons, and the reasons are, established and written on the website. So they're basically now trying to kind of do the same with AI. There's a few other approaches, but I feel that the companies at least will have to be careful not to hijack that agenda, because a lot of people will be defining what it means elsewhere. So I feel that, that same collaboration will still happen. But for open source now that, again, the licensing is well understood, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the companies sort of try to say, yeah, we know best. And, there's a few companies.
Want to not know best. They want this community to somehow emerge, but on its own. So I haven't really seen a startup that actively does it in the right way to basically democratize it and give the reins to somebody else. So they usually, when they bring it to the foundation, they still want to control it in some way, and by contributions or by something else. But at this point, they really always talk about this community emerging and this making it a bigger thing or something, but they really just wish it existed on its own. Yeah. And it's just not how it works.
And I think actually, you blame, VCs for ruining everything, because again, it's your word to use. I blame developer advocates for ruining everything, because every company thinks that they just can fix everything by hiring a whole bunch of developer advocates. They're just everything gets fixed. Now you have a real community, people get the T-shirts, you get pizza everywhere, it's all awesome. No, that's just not how it works, right? It just isn't. You still need to be involved. Actually, speaking of getting involved, I need to be very careful with this pointer. Yeah, so who are we to get involved, right? Because we keep talking about, us getting involved, but so I think, a few things we mentioned about ourselves. But there's actually a few salient points, I think, Tanya, in your biography that makes it interesting.
It basically goes all the failures in my life. You can read all about it in your book. But yeah, I basically spent a few years trying to do exactly that in Russia. So now it's, of course, over. It's been over for a year and a half. But it's not the first time this kind of initiatives I have seen being discussed. And of course, back then, there was no AI on the agenda. But there were other things, and one of the other things was actually infrastructure. And that has been a big topic, and I actually think it's a big topic for a lot of developing countries. And not just me, because one of the initiatives that we got involved with, and we called it Open Infrastructure Foundation, it was actually with Linux Foundation. And the idea was, as the CEO of Linux Foundation described, that when you do infrastructure, doesn't matter, it's always local in countries, so you can't really make it global. But like the International Space Station, when it's in space, it all has to click together.
Yeah, it has to connect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the idea, and that's a bright, almost like United Nations kind of idea was
it's a good kind.
The good kind.
Yes.
To create a space where a lot of other countries can join the discussion. And what I mean is that when you look at the current open source discussions, there is America, there is China, and there is EU, which nobody knows how to look at. Basically, most countries stop looking at it at some point. But there are actually, if you look at who contributes to open source, for example, in Brazil, there is a lot of greenfield contributors, for example, in telecoms. And you know why? Because equipment is really expensive. Mm-hmm. There is no subsidies. There is no Huawei going there. There is no way you can get the base station cheaply, which means that everybody's using open source and everybody has to figure out somehow the interest.
Yeah, basically cobble it together, in a way.
But there is no standard. So when you go from one favela to another, it's a different telecom provider. There is no compatibility. There is no interoperability. There is none of that. So basically the idea was of this foundation to talk about standardization more than new projects, because the projects are already there. They're in open source. A lot of, even like in telecom world, a lot of companies actually contributed stuff like Ericsson and some others. Facebook and there is a thing because they actually stole the.
It's finding the reason though. Facebook basically figured out that they kind of like hit a ceiling, established by the infrastructure providers. They would like to have more people on the platform, but those people are not connected. So they basically have to fix that problem of connectivity on the ground. And there's this Magma, Open Magma, project that they created, which is kind of fun.
Which is very expensive.
Yeah.
But basically the idea was, okay, there are a lot of other countries. And one of those countries used to be Russia, that had some also local infrastructure questions, like how do we make it? Mm-hmm. And what we tried to do, and we basically created a bunch of non-profit organizations to work with it. And we at that point got a bunch of governmental support in terms of both money and lobbying powers. The idea was to organize the market in such a way that these vertical projects can emerge. And by vertical projects, I mean the end products that consist of a lot of open source components. And those open source components, of course, need to also be supported locally. And there should be some people who are putting them together, so system integrators. So if you look at it, there are a lot of different elements that should appear on the market for it to happen. Mm-hmm. And why I'm even talking about this, yes, the Russian market is in the past, but why I'm talking about it is because a lot of things happening these days in AI actually look exactly like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So have anybody seen how the Andreessen Horowitz paper looks about what infrastructure do you need to run LLMs? Nobody has.
Holding all those hands. Okay, nice. Question.
So you can look it up. So it's in their blog, A16Z. And it's actually purely open source, of course, stack.
Mm-hmm. It just so happens that most of the companies they invested in, but it's all over
for you. But basically, what they're saying is, okay, let's suppose that LLMs exist. Doesn't matter, is it ChatGPT giving you API, or is it Llama, or is it some other model that you want to use? Even on top of that, you need a bunch of infrastructure to run it. You need to starting like this databases, and a lot of other things. You basically need to orchestrate it. There is a lot of stuff you need to just run it. And to do that, they basically provide their snapshot of architecture, how they see it. Of course, it will change somewhat, but you can look it up, and there is already a whole bunch of projects that to provide the end product need to exist. So Andreessen Horowitz, being a big money provider, can just invest in all of this tech. But we actually spent a bunch of time in Silicon Valley talking to different funds, and most of them don't have this whole stack approach. So they invest in pieces here and there. They hope they like get some of them, some value. But the idea is that if you go to a greenfield where no projects exist, there is like the whole bunch of stuff that needs to appear, both from the regulation part and from the products investment part.
And I guess an imperfect analogy that I have is, we had like a lot of, bits and pieces of open source software back in the 80s and even 70s, but it had to be distributions, right? When the first notion of like a BSD or like Linux distribution appeared, it basically became this, like what Tanya is saying, full stack of useful stuff. And you can just, it's not something that you need to piece together. You can just take it and it's useful right away. So we feel that, a lot of that will happen in AI. And once it does, it will be yet another boost, to the entire ecosystem, because all of a sudden you would have this, blueprints. It's like a distribution of, LLM useful stuff. I don't know what it's going to be called, but like that, or, for, let's say, geospatial or something. So watch that space. I think that's actually a very powerful approach.
And we have and this is like, at this point, just our opinion, but we have this opinion that at some point, the way it happened with cloud before, at some point, the way you look at infrastructure and the way you look at compute would be through a different interface. And this is what actually Andreessen Horowitz is saying as well, but for LLMs, is, okay, you don't even need to know what it runs on, what model it runs on. Basically, your interface is a different interface.
And actually, Hugging Face is a perfect place to prove that thesis.
Hugging Face is doing exactly the same. It's all running on Amazon.
Well, actually, they don't even know, the people don't even know where it's running.
Nobody knows it. Exactly. They're running on Amazon just because they got a good deal from them. It's basically Amazon investment in them in terms of compute. But at some point, if you look at it, so people run models on Hugging Face, and the compute comes from somewhere, and you can substitute the clouds as much as you want. You don't even need to know what's inside. So basically, it becomes like a different interface to the resources, a different interface to compute, a different interface to infrastructure.
Yes.
And this is actually also an interesting shift in open source world, because it's, of course, all this infrastructure components and projects have to exist, but they become so that all the developers, they're not even getting visible. So basically, they are not visible. So it's a problem with Hugging Face, for example. It's using, of course, a lot of open source. Everybody knows it. They post blogs about it, but not when people are using it, they don't know it because it's a proprietary project, and none of these developers doing that software get any claim, basically nothing. They getting nothing.
Yeah, and that's a different angle of it. How do you actually create an economy that basically recognizes and, incentivizes various sort of people? What's interesting to me in AI is that open source actually, by and large, and that is a statement in a way of our collective failure, but I think it's a correct statement. So the statement is it got defined by engineers. Right now, again, we go to conferences and we say, we're all about inclusivity and, people who contribute like a documentation patch are as important as engineers. And it's all important, and we say that, but by and large, open source gets defined by engineers. That's just the reality of the situation. I feel that with AI, we can actually redefine it and really get to that inclusivity that we tried with, traditional open source, because with AI, you cannot just rely on engineers. You also have to rely on subject domain experts, to train this model, right? Because at the end of the day, what your model tells you back, right? You're talking suppose you're trying to fine-tune, ChatGPT to diagnose a disease, right? You actually need real doctors to look at the output and say, this makes sense and this doesn't, right? So in this whole cycle of training, you now have people who have nothing to do with engineering. And again, places like Hugging Face, they realize it, they're trying to provide tools, for these people to collaborate with engineers. But to me, none of them, like this collective, like doctors for sure don't know where the computer's coming from, right? But even the engineers, they really don't care. So our prediction in all of this is, I actually fear that big cloud providers might suffer the fate of telcos. Remember how telcos wanted to be bigger than just dumb pipes? And that never happened. Like, telcos wanted to be Facebooks. Telcos wanted to be Googles, right? But they just remained to be dumb pipes. Providers of, useful bandwidth and everything else.
No sense of anybody from CDC?
Yeah, exactly. Or, here you go. So it's the same deal. I think, it's basically the public cloud providers are going to be exactly the same, just dumb providers of compute. Storage is slightly different, but even storage, I think, will be redefining.
And I think the reason why we're talking about it is that, yes, a lot of regulations are happening, a lot of new organizations have been created, but we don't see it as a bad thing. We actually see it as a just recomposition of all this current stuff that's there for reasons. And these reasons are not always bad reasons like regulations, but some of them are actually just because they're new technologies, new exciting community joining even this discussion that never were before.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess I have a question for you. Are we staying in Cyprus so people can talk to us? What's next?
That's a good question. But COSTAS is saying that, so basically this is the place that we wanted to be for all this kind of discussions.
I think I'm that guy in the middle. I self-identify with that guy.
Okay, I'll be the coffee one.
Okay.
But basically, it's the place where all these discussions can happen, and we hope to bring it to the level of universities and maybe even some other organizations that want to join it on the European level. But it also just could be a place for people who want to join the discussion that are not engineers, for example, to join. And for that, we have to thank AI.
Yep.
But I think it's actually quite exciting, all the new places where people can contribute, not just in terms of developing software, but new foundations, new even definitions. You can actually join, for example, the OSS initiative to redefine what open source for AI is, so it's pretty much open. So a lot of those things actually want people's opinions these days. And again, for example, we've been looking at what different events happen, and not just in Cyprus, but in general for AI in open source. And the answer is...
Not much.
Not much. The answer is not much.
So that's why it's different. And again, I know I actually had a few conversations, people have sort of existing and, ongoing open source kind of organizations and what have you in Cyprus. This is different, not just for the sake of being different, although, as we're all engineers, right? It's you don't improve the old man. You build a new thing. But the new thing is there exactly for these reasons, right? Because if we wanted to be forward-looking, we wanted to basically be tracking where it's going, as opposed to just celebrating the way the open source, that we know is today. So again, it doesn't mean that, there won't be organizations in Cyprus, Ubuntu user groups or, Java user groups, right? That's all useful. That's cool. This is slightly different because again, it's more looking forward than using what's already there.
So maybe questions from the audience? Or we scared everybody?
Yeah.
Back to CRA and the regulations in the EU. I haven't heard of this initiative, but you presented those guys from the EU Commission as a bunch of narrow-minded, old-fashioned guys, but probably they're trying to beat some threats, right? Why did it appear at all? So it probably has some substance behind this initiative.
I think you're in a perfect position to answer that question.
There are a lot of conspiracy theories about it, how did it happen? So actually, there was the funniest one I heard from a Kids Foundation.
Yes.
But there are a lot of conspiracy theories. Some of them are looking at open source as basically U.S. So open source foundations as U.S. corporations trying to enforce something in Europe. and basically how can we trust US software and everything like that. Some of them are looking at this saying like GDPR was so successful, we can do it again. So like for GDPR and the fines that companies are paying for GDPR are huge. Like Google is paying
billions. Yeah, like I think by this point it's like billion or something,
So there are some theories that Europe thought it's a good idea to just collect a lot of fines on it. But I actually think it's different. And I think it's just as usual with politics, it depends who has the strongest lobbying power. And if you look at Europe, it's huge corporations like Siemens who have a strong lobbying power. So they're lobbying whatever is good for them.
Yes.
And if you think that open source foundations are lobbying anything, they're not. They actually, just like they're not positioned for that, they have no people employed by them who know how to do that. And basically the whole discussion is, we are good guys, we are global by design, so let's just educate the market. So let's just tell them we're good guys.
Yep.
And basically that's not what companies and what large corporations want, and they have stronger lobbying power. But there is also this trend, which, again, I've been seeing for years, that's called techno-nationalism. And this is basically the idea that countries understand that if politics gets accelerated, they suffer if they depend on other countries.
Yes.
So they want at least the infrastructure inside the country. So this was one of the efforts that actually Russia was doing. But these days we see it in a lot of countries, and EU is not different. EU recognizes that if they actually depend on other countries, then it's like if something goes wrong, if there is a vulnerability, if there is something that could be exploited against them. So that's what they wanted to protect from.
Yeah, which they're not actually completely wrong about it, right? But again, it's just the nature of the game. So, and the way they try to get into the game is through political means, because that's all they know, right? They're politicians. They don't know how to join a mailing list, right? They know how to, legislate. But even if you take vulnerabilities, like all of our projects, have basically disclosure procedures. And again, some of them are like super important, like Linux, the kernel itself. If something gets discovered that you can hack a Linux kernel, that's really bad for everybody. So there's a very strict set of, guidelines of how you go about disclosing that. And if you look into how it's put together, it's very US and China-centric at this point. US because of historical reasons, because US was basically the first one to kind of figure out, that it's in everybody's best interest to kind of have a responsible way of doing that. China because, again, it wants to be self-sufficient. But with Europe, I think, they feel kind of left out. So, again, they're only included by the open source developers that are basically within that realm of, let's say, even vulnerability disclosure. So they go to, again, ridiculous, ideas like, oh, yeah, let's have the international vulnerability database. Like, how many of ridiculous CVEs have you guys seen? Like, I see ridiculous CVEs all the time, right? Because the system is completely misaligned. And if European government is, using CVE as the sort of this inroad into vulnerability disclosure, that is completely misguided. So I think, things like that, to your point, they feel that they're missing out on something, but the way they try to fix the problem is completely misguided.
And there are no people who knows what's going on in this industry. So
well, we do.
on that committee, right?
They actually are on that committee, and at least from the open source side, because again, that was open source Congress for.
Mm-hmm.
But again, even the open source Congress had to create this, how they call it, the memo.
What's called? Yes, the credo.
Of course, that they wanted to lobby in front of European Union, and they couldn't.
Yeah.
Because open source is not one organization.
It's not even that it's not one organization. The biggest newsflash that it's not going to work out was from the Italians in the room, because the Italians saw the name Credo and they're like, and I'm like, why? And they're like, you do know that we're mostly Catholic, and Credo actually means something in Catholicism? And I'm like, oh yeah, that actually makes sense, but none of us Americans actually thought about it. And then it's like, oh yeah, and that's why it's never going to work. because it's a very American viewpoint into what needs to be done. We don't even know that creator is maybe not the best name for, this thing that we're trying to create.
But basically, the democracy didn't even work in a room full of 50 people. So how can it work in a room full of 30 countries?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's not always a bad thing, but in this particular regards, again, when there are other lobbying powers that are huge and that are strong, it's like there is just no way.
Mm-hmm.
So you can try and play this game, but I
better not. Yeah.
But I actually don't see it happening.
Totally his practice, but in Europe, how is it conservatory and the philosophical foundation? Are these organizations motivated to support the other?
It's weird because it's weird. So Linux Foundation actually had to come out of, sort of its usual US, mostly US-centric, sort of mindset and even create Linux Foundation Europe, specifically to basically track these things and, make sure that there's at least a place to discuss it. And, I actually had a discussion with the folks who were behind LF Europe, and they basically all told me, they tried to sort of work through the existing organizations, but most of the existing organizations, at least again, and that's sort of the viewpoint of one particular set of people, so take it with a grain of salt. But, the viewpoint is that most of the existing organizations, they are either too old school or to the point of being dormant, right? Maybe there's like Free Software Foundation, but it's again, like it's old school in a sense that it cares about things that are ultimate and universal, but it doesn't really care about this and now. Like Free Software Foundation is all about absolutes, like the freedom of the software needs to be absolute. But again, if you look at most of the software today, it's not even licensed by, the GPL, it's actually licensed by the hacker license. So there's a misalignment there. There is the European Freedom Software Association or something like that. Yeah, exactly. So they do a lot of things, but let me put it this way. So again, to your question, why European government isn't doing it, they're basically looking at the open source as a supply chain. And they see that most of that supply chain gets produced by basically three open source foundations. It is Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation, and again, when I say Linux Foundation, I actually include all of the umbrella foundations. Because again, how many of you do know that RISC-V Foundation is a Linux Foundation project? Probably not too many of you, but it is. So again, all of these different foundations, actually, they are under the big umbrella of the Linux Foundation and Eclipse Foundation. So the three top foundations that produce that amount of software that the European regulators need to care about come from these three foundations. So it's kind of like, by that nature, goes to show that is who they need to engage with and kind of like, talk about it. And everybody else, even OSI, feels like they're excluded from that conversation. Because, again, I don't think that European, let's say, politicians look at OSI as a, this sort of conversation partner, because OSI doesn't really produce software. It's a steward of the definition of the open source, but it's not really producing anything that goes into that supply chain that we, at this point need to care about.
But when we talk about supply chain, I think a very good example is China.
Yeah.
Because that's the only place and the only time that it actually really happened. So basically, China figured out the same thing about supply chain like 20 years ago. And one thing that they did is basically they figured out from the microelectronics perspective that all the chip production is really dependent on other countries. And when I say that, it's not only U.S., but U.S. is in many ways the gating point. Like if you look at what instruments are used for chip design, it's basically just like two of them, and they're all in U.S. So it's like Synopsys and Cadence.
Cadence, yeah.
But if you look at other things, like how do you do lithography? It's one Netherlands company. And how do you do the lasers? And one Japan company. So basically, China said that they don't want to have that dependencies, and they spent 20 years redeveloping all of these parts inside of China. So this what, like, if you want really techno-nationalism, you will go piece by piece, And they actually didn't just redefine all these components, they also created the integrator that can work and put it all together into factory. And they chose the open source architecture, which is like RISC-V architecture. So these days, a lot of Chinese production of microelectronics is on RISC-V. But basically they said, okay, we understand how to work with open source. To work with open source, we need, if we want like true techno-nationalism and not depend on like all these foundations and whatnot, we need the companies that can support it locally, we need the companies that can produce it locally, and we need the companies that can integrate it locally.
Yep.
And then working with open source is not that scary anymore because it's like all locally supported.
Yeah, China is actually very funny that way. So in interest of full disclosure, I spent a lot of time working with them. So it helped, for example, with Mulan license, which is sort of based, roughly on the Apache license. It is a very different mindset that they have, that basically goes to show that to them, to your point, Tanya, it really is a lens of more or less, privatizing those pieces of the supply chain, but not sort of regulating them. So it's like they're not in the mindset of telling U.S. corporations what to do, like U.S. open source foundations, but more in the mindset of like, what can we do inside, to satisfy the local need, right? And Europe is very much different in that respect. I think, Europe still for right reasons, like I actually agree with that, wants to remain a global player. But that sort of, to your question, comes with this challenge of like, who do you collaborate, right? Because if you want to help redefine what it means to have a secure open source global supply chain, you actually need to collaborate with the right people on the other side, right? And if you're just trying to do a legislation inside of Europe without that collaboration, bad things are going to happen. So like that fine-tuning still needs to happen.
That is a discussion, right?
Well, yeah, no, there's absolutely a discussion, but I think it's very one-sided in a sense, and that's actually, again, going back to Tanya's, favorite conspiracy theory. What I'm really not able to comprehend is why local big, European headquartered corporations like Siemens and BMW and Volkswagen are not present at these meetings. Because all of the global US corporations they have a lot to lose. Are those companies okay? I guess they are. Do they not know what's happening? I am sure they do. So there's like some weirdness going on in there as well. So there's definitely, discussions. There's definitely collaboration happening, but it feels like the cast of characters at the table is still not quite balanced to basically make the best, decision and put the best legislations together.
But the legislation will happen they're in process, they're in motion.
Yeah.
This is like this schizophrenic part of this because the right people are not at the table, but the legislation will go through anyway.
Through anyway, yeah, exactly.
So you can't really stall it long enough to put all the right people at the table.
Yep.
So that's just, and again, it's not like something that once it happens, it's forever and there are no ways around it and whatever. But it will just move the balance, and the power of the power balance will change.